1 year ago, on October 7, 2023, the world watched in horror as a new chapter of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict unfolded. The air was thick with tension, and the streets were filled with uncertainty and fear. Hamas, the militant group controlling Gaza, launched a surprise attack on Israel. This sudden and unexpected assault shattered the fragile peace that had been holding. This ignited a brutal war that has left a trail of devastation and despair in its wake. Buildings crumbled and lives were irreparably changed. The anniversary of this conflict is not a time for celebration but a moment for somber reflection. Families on both sides mourn their lost loved ones, and the scars of war are still fresh. We must examine the events of the past year, their global impact, and the prospects for a future free from violence. The world has been watching, and the international community has been vocal in its calls for peace. The initial Hamas offensive caught Israel off guard, leading to a swift and deadly response. The Israeli military mobilized quickly, determined to defend its citizens and territory. Israeli airstrikes rained down on Gaza, targeting Hamas infrastructure and personnel. The skies over Gaza were filled with the sounds of explosions and the sight of smoke rising from the rubble. The conflict quickly escalated, drawing in regional actors and raising fears of a wider conflagration. Neighboring countries watched with bated breath, concerned about the potential for the violence to spill over their borders. The international community, caught in the middle of this volatile situation, scrambled to contain the violence and prevent further bloodshed. Diplomatic efforts were intensified, with numerous meetings and negotiations taking place. The human cost of this conflict has been staggering. Hospitals have been overwhelmed with the injured, and the number of casualties continues to rise. Thousands of lives have been lost on both sides, with countless others injured and displaced. Refugees have fled their homes, seeking safety and shelter wherever they can find it. The physical destruction in Gaza is immense, with homes, hospitals, and schools reduced to rubble. The infrastructure has been decimated, and the path to rebuilding seems long and arduous. The conflict has also deepened the political and social divides in the region, making the already challenging task of finding a peaceful solution even more daunting. Communities are more polarized than ever, and the hope for reconciliation seems distant. As we mark this grim anniversary, the world must not turn away from the suffering in Gaza and Israel. Humanitarian aid is crucial, and moments of silence remind us of the lives lost and the pain endured. We must demand an end to the violence, a commitment to dialogue, and a renewed effort to address the root causes of this decades-long conflict. Peace rallies and diplomatic talks are steps in the right direction, but much more needs to be done. Only then can we hope to see a future where peace and security prevail for both Israelis and Palestinians. The vision of families living together in harmony and the symbols of peace painted on walls are reminders of what we strive for, a world where conflict is replaced by understanding and cooperation. The outbreak of war in Gaza sent shockwaves through the international community. The sudden escalation of violence caught many by surprise, leading to immediate and widespread condemnation from nations around the globe. World leaders condemned the violence and called for restraint from both sides. The urgency of their messages underscored the gravity of the situation, as they emphasized the need for dialogue and peaceful resolution. Turkey's President Erdogan, a staunch critic of Israel, accused the Israeli government of genocide and vowed severe consequences. His statements were among the most vehement, reflecting a deep-seated frustration and anger that resonated with many in the region. His fiery rhetoric reflected the anger and frustration felt by many in the Muslim world over the escalating conflict. Protests erupted in several Muslim-majority countries, with demonstrators demanding justice and an end to the violence. The European Union, a major player in Middle East diplomacy, also expressed its deep concern and urged an immediate ceasefire. EU leaders highlighted the importance of returning to negotiations and finding a sustainable solution to the conflict. EU officials called for the release of hostages held by Hamas and stressed the need for unimpeded humanitarian access to Gaza. They emphasized that humanitarian aid must reach those in need without delay to alleviate the suffering of the civilian population. The United States, a close ally of Israel, found itself walking a diplomatic tightrope. Balancing its support for Israel with calls for restraint, the U.S. aimed to prevent further escalation while maintaining its strategic alliances. While expressing support for Israel's right to defend itself, the U.S. also urged restraint and called for de-escalation. American officials worked behind the scenes to mediate and push for a ceasefire, recognizing the delicate nature of the situation. International organizations like the United Nations and the International Committee of the Red Cross joined the chorus of condemnation. They stressed the importance of protecting civilians and ensuring that humanitarian laws were upheld. They highlighted the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza, where the civilian population bore the brunt of the fighting. The images of destruction and suffering underscored the urgent need for international intervention. The ICRC called for access to provide essential medical aid and assistance to those affected by the conflict. Their efforts were crucial in addressing the immediate needs of the injured and displaced. The international response to the Gaza war was swift and unequivocal. The violence had to stop. Protests and demonstrations around the world echoed this sentiment, with people from all walks of life calling for an end to the bloodshed. The challenge now was to translate these calls for peace into concrete action. Diplomatic efforts intensified, with peace talks and negotiations aiming to bring about a lasting resolution. The world watched closely, hoping for a breakthrough that would finally bring peace to the region. On the anniversary of the Hamas attack, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the nation, declaring victory in the conflict. He painted a picture of a strong and resolute Israel, standing firm against its enemies. Netanyahu vowed to continue his hardline approach against Hamas, promising to crush the militant group and ensure the security of Israeli citizens. Netanyahu's victory speech, however, was not without its critics. Many pointed out that the conflict had come at a heavy cost, with Israeli lives lost and the country deeply divided. They argued that Netanyahu's aggressive policies had only served to exacerbate tensions with Hamas and make a lasting peace even more elusive. The Prime Minister's address also raised concerns about the future of Gaza. Netanyahu gave no indication of a willingness to engage in meaningful peace negotiations. Instead, he doubled down on his commitment to maintaining Israeli military superiority and controlling Gaza's borders. Netanyahu's vision for the future seemed to be one of continued conflict and control, leaving many wondering if true peace was even possible. His speech served as a stark reminder of the deep-seated mistrust and animosity that has fueled the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for decades. Section 4. A humanitarian catastrophe, Gaza on the brink. The war in Gaza has triggered a humanitarian crisis of catastrophic proportions. The densely populated Strip, already struggling under a crippling blockade, has been pushed to the brink of collapse. The relentless bombardment has left a trail of destruction, with homes, hospitals, and vital infrastructure reduced to rubble. The most urgent crisis is the shortage of essential supplies. Food, water, medicine, and fuel are in critically short supply. Hospitals, overwhelmed with casualties, are struggling to function with limited resources. The lack of electricity has made life unbearable for many, cutting off access to clean water and sanitation. The conflict has also displaced hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, forcing them to flee their homes in search of safety. Makeshift shelters are overflowing, and many are living in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions, vulnerable to disease outbreaks. The psychological toll of the conflict is immeasurable. Children in particular have been traumatized by the violence and loss, their futures uncertain. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is a stain on the conscience of the world. Urgent action is needed to provide immediate relief to the suffering population and to address the long-term consequences of this devastating conflict. Section 5. A plea for peace. The world demands a ceasefire. In every corner of the globe, voices are rising in unison, demanding an end to the bloodshed and a return to peace. As the war in Gaza rages on, the international community has intensified its calls for a ceasefire. The images of destruction and suffering have galvanized people from all walks of life to speak out against the ongoing violence. Diplomats are working tirelessly to broker a truce, urging both sides to lay down their arms and come to the negotiating table. These efforts are not just about stopping the immediate violence, but also about paving the way for a sustainable peace. The United Nations has been at the forefront of these efforts, with the Security Council holding emergency meetings to address the crisis. The UN's role is crucial, as it brings together diverse nations to work towards a common goal of peace. The United States, despite its unwavering support for Israel, has also joined the calls for a ceasefire. This highlights the complexity of international relations, where even staunch allies recognize the need for a halt in hostilities. The European Union, a major donor of humanitarian aid to Gaza, has reiterated its commitment to finding a peaceful solution to the conflict. Their involvement underscores the humanitarian aspect of the crisis, emphasizing the need to alleviate the suffering of civilians. Arab states, traditionally vocal in their support for the Palestinian cause, have also called for an end to the violence. Their unified stance is a powerful reminder of the regional implications of the conflict. However, achieving a lasting ceasefire has proven to be an elusive goal. The history of failed peace talks and continued fighting casts a long shadow over current efforts. Deep mistrust between Israel and Hamas, coupled with their differing objectives, has hampered negotiations. This mistrust is rooted in decades of conflict and a complex web of political, social, and historical factors. The international community faces the daunting task of bridging the divide and finding common ground between two sides locked in a seemingly intractable conflict. It requires not just diplomatic skill, but also a deep understanding of the cultural and historical context. Despite the challenges, the calls for a ceasefire must continue. The global peace rallies and international solidarity movements are a testament to the collective desire for an end to the violence. The alternative, a protracted war with devastating consequences for both Israelis and Palestinians, is simply unacceptable. The humanitarian crisis that would ensue would be catastrophic, affecting generations to come. Therefore, the world must persist in its demand for peace, for the sake of all those who suffer in this conflict.